Welcome to week 11 of our mini lectures in 7512 NSC Aviation Leadership and Communication. Well, we've covered a fair amount throughout the course, and this is the last lecture of new material before we go on to the case studies where we combine the course together. And what we're doing again in this one is where we've looked at leadership styles and approaches. We're looking at the other things that leaders have to be aware of to manage followers in the workforce today. We're going to be looking at the leadership of culture, ethics and diversity. Now, culture itself, we're going to be looking at organisational culture as well as international culture. Ethics we covered earlier in the course, and it's come up from time to time when we've spoken about other areas of the course. And diversity, of course, is making sure we have an all-inclusive workforce. So what are we going to be doing in this one? Well, we're going to be talking about the power of culture and what defines high and low performing cultures. We're going to be talking about different approaches to talking about organisational culture, and we're going to be describing Gert Hofstede's theory of national culture, because today, with globalisation, we're seeing more and more people from different nationalities working in teams together. We're going to be talking about the sort of practices that can help foster an ethical work environment, and talking about how leaders can make sure that their development really adds towards an ethical culture. Finally, we're going to be talking about diversity. This is a topic which comes up time and time again in the workforce, and it depends on the type of country that you're in. But diversity is something where we are harnessing the full potential of our population and not just part of it. Okay, so what's organisational culture itself? Well, very often people say that culture is simply, it's the way that we do business. The formal definition, it's an aggregate of beliefs, norms, attitudes, values, assumptions, but really the way of doing things. When you go into an organisation, people will often say, this is the way we do things in this company. And that's what culture is. No magic there. Often it comes from history. Very often organisations, when you join them, will talk about their history and where they've come from, how they developed. And this is a part of government organisations, military organisations, and also commercial organisations. People like to talk about where they've come from and how it's made the organisation the strong part of the economy that it is today. Very often we find that culture comes from all those values, customs, practices that have worked for the company, and it's what gives an organisation purpose. And particularly, people make sure that they use their culture as a source of competitive advantage. Very often when you look at airlines, they are trying through their advertising to put over, this is our airline. This is what we stand for. Singapore Airlines puts out Singapore Girl and tries to show it epitomises really strong service. Other airlines try to put over a picture of, we're a friendly airline. Flying with us is like being part of a big family. So really culture is a really important part for an organisation's survival in the very competitive economies that we have today. So culture itself, what sort of power does it have? Well, the first thing is, when people join an organisation, we'll be talking about how the organisation, right from the day that they recruit you, at the interview, they'll be searching for, how well do you fit within our organisation? How well do we think you're going to adapt into our culture? That is, they're looking for someone who's going to fit in. And once you join, from the moment you arrive, they'll be trying to shape you to fit even better within that company. So we'll be seeing as to how that culture really helps build up the unity within the company. Everyone sees themselves as part of a big family and one big team, and they know as to how they're going to adapt to changes in that external environment. So what makes a high-performing and a low-performing culture? Well, first of all, a weak culture generally shows a lack of agreement on key values and norms amongst its members. And you can often tell that by within 30 minutes of when you arrive at a company, simply by talking to people, and you find disagreement about certain things. People don't seem to have an agreement on what the company stands for. But a strong culture, you can feel it straight away. Everyone seems to be singing from the same sheet of music. Everyone is behind the same set of values. So, weak cultures, where do they come from? Insular thinking, people tending not to be good team members, being resistant to change. A politicised internal environment, that is, the people who get on are the people who perhaps are the ones who say all the right things, don't bring any bad news, etc. And that often leads to unhealthy promotion practices. That is, the people who are getting promoted are the ones who seem to fit in with the company message rather than the ones who show, I am going to help build an even stronger organisation. Strong cultures come from the culture reinforcement tools, very people oriented, also results oriented, because we said it's not just important to focus on people, we've got to make sure we focus on the job and the results and getting the best we can possibly do. So when we look at organisational cultures, we can grade them according to strategic focus. Are they internally focused or looking at the outside environment? Inside the company, we look at, is it stable or very dynamic? So if we've got a stable environment with an internal focus, we get a bureaucratic culture. Lots of focuses on rules, procedures and so on. And that's not wrong. Organisations have got to have it. If we've got a stable degree of environmental turbulence but an external focus, we get a competitive culture. That is, the organisation is looking to how it responds to changes outside whilst also trying to stay stable internally. If we get a dynamic environmental and turbulence, we find that with a strategic focus, we get a cooperative culture. But if we've got that dynamic environmental turbulence with a strategic focus, we get an adaptive culture. Now you might sit back and say, well, you know, a company should have an adaptive culture. But a culture's also got to have its rules and systems and procedures. For example, the two big manufacturers of aircraft, Airbus and Boeing, are very process-oriented because they're engineering organisations predominantly. But we also want a cooperative culture within, plus a competitive culture. So organisations need to look at these four things to different degrees. And we'll talk about that in the course. We now come to Gert Hofstede's look at the way in which people can be graded on a national culture standard. The first thing he came up with is, well, depending on the country you come from, there can be a focus on individualism versus collectivism. And for example, we know the United States is always talking about the individual and how anyone can aspire to be president. Whereas we find that certain countries, for example, in South America, believe that it's important for everyone to work together. Asian cultures are the same. That is, they look towards collectivism. The next thing is, we find that some people look to avoid high uncertainty, whereas others try to make sure that they actually have everything sewn up where they are prepared to take risks. And of course this is important in aviation, because where we get people who are prepared to take on that high uncertainty and take risks, that can be a problem in itself. The next thing that we take a look at is power distance. That is, in certain cultures, there's a huge gap between the followers and the leader, whereas in other cultures, it can be a very low amount. For example, Australia, there tends to be a very low power distance between the leader and the followers. And that can be exemplified by our prime ministers. Very often, they ride in the front seat of the car with the driver rather than the back seat, as you see in other countries. No doubt about Australians, egalitarian to the end. Then we have long-term orientation versus short-term. And for example, one of the things we'll take a look at in the course is how the global financial crisis was caused by a long-term orientation culture, putting all of their investments with a country that had a short-term orientation culture. That is, we live for today, not for tomorrow. When we get money, we spend it. And then we come up against masculinity, femininity. Now, we're not talking about whether you're male or female here. We're talking about whether you have a masculine type culture, that is, you're powerful and assertive, versus feminine. We say a feminine type culture is where people are more compassionate and caring. For example, we know Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden and Denmark, tend to be more feminine in their outlook because they're very caring and compassionate cultures. And what we'll see is how these work together, particularly in aviation, to affect the way in which certain companies operate. The big thing is, once we've got a culture, how do you sustain it? One of the important things is that bringing about cultural change can be very, very difficult for a company. And just as we found management of change, once you bring about that change, how do you keep it there? So the one thing is, companies very often, when they want to change their culture, go through a defined plan. And we'll talk about in the course about how it takes a long time to change culture within a company. But as soon as you take the pressures away, just like in managing change, the culture can revert to back it was. And so we'll be talking about how to change and sustain a culture. In ethics itself, ethics is about doing the right thing. And we'll talk about how easy it is within a company to have breaches of ethical conduct. And when we look at the news these days, we see it doesn't matter how much you put in, all those negative penalties that we spoke about in an earlier lecture when we were talking about reinforcement, people still engage in unethical conduct. You as a leader have got to be able to recognise the signs, identify it and be able to correct it. But you as a follower have also got to be aware of it. And so we'll talk about all the different tools that companies use, and we'll take a look at some of the aerospace companies and what they actually use. A code of ethics, ethics committees, training programs, disclosure mechanisms, that is a hotline where people can ring up without fear of being identified and accused, and that by people within the workforce. They can ring the hotline and say, look, I'm observing this unethical conduct going on, and the company is forced to, in fact, investigate. And we'll do case studies where we actually look at that one as well. Diversity, of course, when people talk about diversity, they often talk about gender discrimination. But of course, what we know is there are all forms of discrimination. It can be on race, it can be on age, it can be on your ethnicity, it can be on your religion and your sexual orientation. And so one of the things that we learn is that very often people will never admit their prejudices, but prejudices do exist in a workforce. So leaders have to be aware that these prejudices exist, learn to recognise them and learn to correct them. Because whenever we discriminate against people for any of those reasons that we listed, we are perhaps cutting out one of the really powerful strengths that we could have in our workforce. And if we look at it these days, for example, Stephen Hawking, a very, very famous physicist, of course, suffers from motor neuron disease. People could have written him off and simply put him into a home and said, there, you'll be able to live a comfortable life. But Hawking wouldn't take that, and he simply said, hey, I am going to make sure that I continue to contribute to science. And he's been a very active contributor since. So what we have to learn is there is strengths in being able to use diversity and to harness it into our workforce. And of course, the one thing that we find with diversity is having a corporate philosophy, building a culture within the workforce that shows the strengths of people and being able to put it in as a measuring device, something that we communicate about regularly, making sure there's always top management support about it, and making sure that this is captured in our human resource practices. So these are things that as a leader you need to be aware of and make sure that within the organisation and within your part of the workforce that you ensure that these are being supported, and as a follower that you actually follow them as well. So in this mini lecture we've looked at a range of different things, and we've seen as to how each of them really affects the way that organisations work. We've looked at, first of all, the importance of culture And culture is something that can be felt within an organisation. And we'll be showing you as to how you can measure culture within an organisation and how culture often has to be changed and how you can bring about change there. We've spoken about Gert Hofstede's theory of national cultures, so that even if you have an international makeup amongst your workforce, you can learn to recognise how people's nationality can affect the way they think, and so recognise how you can use this to the greatest strength. We're looking at ethical conduct and what your role is as a leader in making sure that ethical conduct is not only followed within an organisation, but all the various systems exist to make sure that ethics is followed through. And with diversity, we'll be explaining as to how you can recognise the strength in having a diverse workforce, how you can stop prejudices from stopping a diverse workforce, and how an organisation can make sure that it embraces that diversity to ensure that it adds to the strength of the organisation. Thank you.